Which tank is the hardest to play in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail? Is there even a ranking here? Or are they all equally simple and it doesn't matter? Well, I ran some polls to gather some data with results ranging from 3,000 to 10,000 votes, which definitely shows some interesting information. So what does the community of Final Fantasy XIV, or at least the ones that we can poll here, think is the hardest tank job? Let me start by briefly going over how the polling worked. I'm perfectly aware that players come from many different backgrounds of knowledge, and due to the freedom of polls like this, I can't possibly make sure that, say, only Savage Raiders voted on a poll. And even if I did, those kinds of specifications would reduce the vote count so much that we might not be able to gauge anything useful from the results we would get. So, each poll is as simple as: which job do you think is hardest in your opinion? Plain and simple. And then I use all the information I gathered to figure out the finer details. You'll hopefully understand later. Second, if I made a poll asking which tank is the hardest, including all 4, we would only be able to tell for certain that the highest voted job would be accurate, quote unquote, as the other 3 jobs getting less votes doesn't necessarily determine their ranking order as 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. And so I made 6 different polls pitting tanks against each other. Is Warrior or Paladin harder? And so on. This did indeed result in a ranking order, and interestingly, a sanity check of polling all 4 at once showed roughly the same result actually. But that was the voting process. Let's get on with the order. Dead last, Warrior. In every single poll that Warrior featured in, it lost by a landslide, with the closest comparisons being Paladin versus Warrior. What is really interesting about this massive landslide opinion is that when it comes to the hardest content, at least presently, Warrior is considered reasonably difficult by many for reasons that are generally not really considered by players choosing Warrior in that content, and absolutely does not apply outside of this content. As a result, the factors that generally makes Warrior considered easy takes overwhelming precedence over what could make it hard. This also highlights very effectively how, generally, there are probably a lot more of the more casual part of the player base that will be voting on these kinds of polls, which also makes a lot more sense since once it comes to some of this harder content and these more optimize difficulty factors, these are problems that affect players that typically would be at a skill level where it doesn't really matter whether it is harder or not anyway. If you're picking Warrior in those cases, it is for what it provides, not how hard it is for it to provide that. But we will talk about all of these factors all the same, and no, I don't plan on noodling around this kind of all of these potential sources of votes for every job, but I think it is worth explaining how some of these results can make sense from different angles before we dive in. What makes Warrior easy? Just to start, Warrior offensively has 4 cooldowns to keep track of at all, and half of them have charges, making them more flexible on their timing, as well as more relaxed in terms of how exact you need to be on their use. Additionally, because Warrior's personal burst involves no cooldown that boosts the damage of their toolkit at large, compared to something like Fight or Flight, in any content where precise rate buff coordination isn't necessary, Warrior could effectively just hit their cooldowns completely out of order and with no plan, and still be fine. Defensively, Warrior has some of the most forgiving cooldowns in the game, with options like Equilibrium that essentially allows you to undo the damage of goofing up and taking a big hit, assuming you survive, which you often will outside of the hardest content. Tank privilege, baby. The cherry on top is Bloodwetting, a tool that sort of works as a "you need to be at least this tall" effect, where Warrior gets to completely clown on any content not strong enough to properly challenge Bloodwetting alone, which does lead Warrior to seem unreasonably overpowered in more casual content. The cooldown on Warrior's invuln, Holmgang, being only 4 minutes also makes it feel like far less of a commitment to use it on a whim. In a way, Warrior's defensive toolkit, again, especially in more casual content, is exceptionally well made to both reward you for using it proactively to reduce damage, while also working well reactively when you miss the timing, which is a lot more likely to happen when you're still learning the finer details of tanking. Now, what makes Warrior hard? Considering the consensus from the polls that essentially said with big bold letters, Warrior is not hard, it probably makes sense that the only things that make Warrior hard are challenges that are either not seen as that big of a deal, or only affect a very small portion of the player base. The most common difficulty factor that is brought up about Warrior is needing to maintain Surging Tempest. I know, that's not hard. Essentially, when doing your 1-2-3s, you have to take into account whether it is time for eye or path. Where it adds some difficulty, quote-unquote, to it, is that if you accidentally choose wrong while being distracted by other factors, it can feel like you're now stuck waiting 3 more GZDs before you can do anything else without losing damage. This is probably the most visible point of failure and so difficulty for Warrior, because of how obvious it is when you forget about it. A slightly more vague difficulty factor is that among the tanks, Warrior's invuln is the one that does the least. It just prevents you from dying, so if you or your healer does not have a plan for recovery afterwards, you will probably just die. There's plenty of options to recover with though, so this is more a matter of learning what to prepare. When it comes to burst windows, Warrior is a little weird compared to the other tanks, since under optimal circumstances, you'd have 3 onslaughts for it if you didn't need them for mobility, rather than having 2. And while Infuriate looks like 2 charges in 2 minutes, due to the actual fill cleave count you get, Infuriate is more like a 1 in the odd, 2 in the even minute burst deal, assuming you have plenty of uptime, which makes it seem a bit difficult to keep track of. And that leads us to factors that simply are not relevant for most players, and many might not even consider difficulty and more just design. But I will include it just the same. Due to Bloodwedding's rather middling mitigation percentage compared to other tanks, and the fact that Thrill of Battle and Equilibrium are not exactly the most potent so-called DLC mitigations, Warrior is viewed as the most fragile tank in harder content, which means a way to mitigate a mechanic that works for the other tanks just might not be sufficient for Warrior. But this can sometimes be overcome by trading mitigations with your co-tank, or by knowing what Warrior needs. A final, super optimized detail to Warrior is also the fact that their 40% mitigation has counterattacks, so maximizing your damage fully may include finding a way to both keep this on cooldown while also not dying from not having it when you need it, while also catching as many auto attacks with it as possible. Third place, Paladin. Throughout late Endwalker up to the present, often referred to as easier Gunbreaker, it makes good sense that Paladin would land here in the community vote. The job is largely considered to have the best utility options among tanks, some of, if not the best mitigation options, and is the only tank that can continue a large part of its rotation without even being in melee range. What makes Paladin easy? Unlike all of the other tanks, Paladin's filler rotation doesn't really generate resources, leading to a simple priority list that sort of inverts on itself during bursts. On top of that, Paladin's burst is concentrated enough that nearly half of it is effectively the best filler you got left, I guess, making it extremely flexible. Simultaneously, at least half of the burst window is entirely ranged. During its burst, it also only has 5 OGZD attacks to sprinkle in across 8 GZDs, leaving plenty of room to weave defensives as needed. And speaking of defensives, Oath Gauge, allowing Paladin more flexibility on when they use their short mitigation, just makes it way easier to use. You're much less likely to have to worry about getting punished for using your mitigation a bit more aggressively whenever you sit on enough gauge for 2 of them. Options like Holy Spirit also enable Paladin to play safer than other tanks without losing as much damage from, for instance, moving out early. What makes Paladin hard? This one comes down to a bunch of weird factors, because everything we just talked about definitely gives the impression that everything Paladin does is pretty heckin' easy, right? One factor is that while Paladin's filler rotation and the way it sort of flips itself during burst is not intuitive at all. Certainly, the more intuitive rotations are just do a 1, 2, 3, then spend Divine Might and the Atonement combo and start again. But in reality, the optimal filler loop sort of mingles another 1, 2, 3 combo in and sort of starts on the Atonement combo too. The other tanks also generally get nearly all or all of their burst filled with burst buttons, whether resource spenders or special buttons enabled by the burst, while Paladin tends to finish their burst with some random filler jank, which may lead a less experienced player to try to make the perfectly optimal filler jank for every burst, delaying their burst for almost no benefit. Another small factor is how Passage of Arms requires more strict positioning than other tank party mitigation, but is rewarded by being the strongest one. And then there is the part of knowing when is the time for the more complicated utility options like Cover and Clemency. Not to mention taking into account that your shared mitigation, Intervention, needs you to have Guardian or Rampart up to actually be not the worst shared mitigation among the tanks. Yes, also worse than Warrior's Nascent Flash, which is actually really good, by the way. That said, I believe that the biggest contributing factor as to why Paladin is considered harder than Warrior is simply how overwhelmingly busted Warrior seems in more casual content. The bloodwetting factor, if you will. Because when you account for what makes Warrior more complicated, I do think it should come out on top between these two, personally. Second place, Dark Knight. Often referred to as the spammier equivalent to Warrior, and depending on how you play Dark Knight, you may see it as either the one with the least structured and strict rotation among the tanks, or perhaps the most strict rotation, due to what factors contribute to this. What makes Dark Knight easy? When compared to Warrior, Dark Knight's filler attack rotation is similar, but does not have that little caveat that every time you reach a step 3, you have to be sure to choose the right one. In fact, Dark Knight's maintained damage buff is so easy to maintain that it almost feels unnecessary for it to have a timer to begin with. When compared to Paladin and Gunbreaker, Dark Knight doesn't even have a temporary damage buff to play around, which means that in a more casual setting where rate buff alignment isn't a factor, Dark Knight just has a mishmash of damage buttons you can just hit when you feel like it. Them drifting apart doesn't matter either unless someone else has a rate buff for you to capitalize on. That said, what makes Dark Knight hard? This one is partly perceived difficulty and partly challenges Dark Knight has to deal with that the others don't. For the perceived stuff, Dark Knight has for a long time had pretty severe self-sustain problems, and were often considered to have the worst mitigation options due to things like Dark Mind only applying to magic damage. However, throughout Dawntrail, Dark Knight has gotten better self-sustain, so it isn't as bad. And Dark Mind now applies to physical damage as well. However, due to Dark Knight having a tendency to attract players that might not care too much about the whole, you're a tank part of the equation, Dark Knight may often appear very weak defensively in more casual content, giving the impression that it must be much harder to play. When it comes to difficulty that is less just perceived stuff, we start with TBN. Dark Knight is the only tank that has a cost attached to its short cooldown mitigation. However, when used correctly, it refunds itself. And truly fully optimizing your damage may include sneaking an extra 3k MP into the 2-minute burst by getting this refund leading up to it, which means Dark Knight has to know when this is possible in a boss fight to optimize this. Except the damage gained from this is small enough that the vast majority of players simply don't need to worry about this. However, this can be perceived as much harder than it really is if you have not had to actually try to do it. Speaking of rate buffs, the moment you do try to optimize around rate buffs, a lot of attacks that Dark Knight previously kinda just could mindlessly hit at any time suddenly need to be used at strict timings, and if things start drifting, it can be difficult to fix without losing users of the cooldowns over the course of a fight. Living Shadow taking time to spawn in and having the capacity to lose attacks due to too much boss movement, awkward AoE angles and whatnot, also makes some of Dark Knight's actual cooldowns a little difficult to get full value out of. The sheer amount of buttons in the optimal Dark Knight burst also can make it a little intense to do everything in time, especially if it happens to overlap with a situation where you need defensive cooldowns, compared to Paladin and Warrior who have very few OGCDs to worry about. Due to what kind of difficulty all these properties combine together for, what often happens is that players that do not care about rate buff alignment may feel that Dark Knight is extremely simple because all these challenges simply do not apply to them. Simultaneously, players at a skill level where something like rate buff alignment isn't really considered challenging to begin with, will also likely find Dark Knight very easy. Meanwhile, the large space between those two extremes may find different factors of Dark Knight harder than Paladin and Warrior as a result. The hardest tank, Gunbreaker, beating both Warrior and Paladin by a landslide, and even beating Dark Knight by a huge difference. Gunbreaker appears to be considered the agreed king of difficulty among the tanks, despite the most recent major changes supposedly being meant to make it easier rather than harder. Maybe that just speaks volumes about just how hard Gunbreaker was. So, what makes Gunbreaker easy? Relative to Dark Knight, Gunbreaker has a pretty clear-cut burst sequence, thanks to the structure that No Mercy provides, its rotation that Dark Knight sort of lacks. Defensively, Gunbreaker has a much easier time getting value out of the healing in its toolkit, since Aurora has 2 charges and Heart of Corundum is designed to, unless the healing just isn't needed, pop as you drop in HP. In some ways, Heart of Corundum is also sort of a less convoluted version of Paladin's Holy Shelter and Intervention that you can just send with no further thinking. Although, there is a bit of optimization in copying a brutal shell to your target with it. Another minor advantage that Gunbreaker actually shares with Dark Knight is that their gap closers don't do damage, leaving them free to be used only for mobility, although this is a very minor advantage. Another minor advantage Gunbreaker has over Dark Knight is that with Bloodfest being changed to a 1-minute cooldown, Gunbreaker does not have much variance in its odd and even minute bursts, if any at all, to worry about. But depending on the situation and context, this can actually make Dark Knight easier comparatively rather than Gunbreaker. Unfortunately, I don't think that there is that much else to say on the easy front. What makes Gunbreaker hard? In a way, Gunbreaker has a slightly more complicated version of everything one of the other tanks have, meaning that anything that I could point to as easy and convenient will be overshadowed by another tank doing it more easily. Gunbreaker's resource management is by a minor technicality stricter than all of the other tanks, despite having Bloodfest to fill up for every burst, as the most optimal bursts on slow Gunbreaker can actually need a 4th cartridge, and fast can potentially need 5 under certain circumstances. The most optimal bursts also may require perfect planning of cartridges, as that is needed to set up combos just right for every burst, what I like to refer to as Wicked Mercy, where you set it up so that you either use Wicked Talon, the last step of your Gnashing Fang combo, as the first GCD of No Mercy for fast Gunbreaker, or weave the OGCD follow-up right after No Mercy for slow Gunbreaker. In both cases, it adds +1 cartridge needed for the burst itself, and unless downtime or something else gets in your way, you basically use the whole cartridge gauge to carefully manage the combos, because these tricks happen to make your burst exactly long enough that your filler combo breaks before you circle back to it in most situations. So you have to be sure to finish the filler beforehand. Even when we look past this kind of super optimization, Gunbreaker's Gnashing Fang and Double Down cooldowns can lock you into awkward, unusual bursts if you drift anything, deliberately or not, and the only way to fix it is to potentially lose out on Wicked Mercy for the rest of the fight, or lose a cast of Gnashing Fang or Double Down altogether, which admittedly is so catastrophic that it cannot be considered a viable option. Gunbreaker also tends to have more OGCs than both Paladin and Warrior in the burst, some of which are not flexible in timing. Long story short, it is very easy to lose damage on Gunbreaker if things start to get wacky. Gunbreaker also has a bit of the perceived difficulty that Dark Knight has, as another job that tends to attract players that don't really consider the fact that it is a tank. In addition to starting at a significantly higher level where you are expected to at least have a general idea about how defensive cooldowns need to be used. It makes very good sense that Gunbreaker would be viewed as the hardest tank to play, all things considered. But with all that said, which tank do you find the hardest? There can be many reasons depending on what you focus on. For example, a perfectionistic player might find Gunbreaker or Paladin super frustrating to play because if you make a mistake, it is super obvious and hard to ignore, staring you in the face for the rest of the battle. A player focused on harder content might weigh Warrior as harder simply because its defensive kit faces a slightly greater challenge than the other tanks at times. Yet, a more chill player might appreciate Warrior's ability to recover after the fact. My personal feeling presently is that Paladin seems the easiest to me. Paladin main, by the way, that makes sense, with Warrior and Dark Knight somewhat evenly in the middle, with Gunbreaker as the hardest. Precisely because of how easy it is to accidentally goof it and drift a cooldown. Obviously, you just have to, not goof it, and with practice, that is not hard at all. But it is like carrying a plate with one hand. It is very easy to do, but it's also extremely easy to shatter the plate if you forget about it and drop it. Please do let me know your opinions in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, when I did a similar survey in Endwalker, the ranking was actually exactly the same. Gunbreaker hardest, then Dark Knight, then Paladin, then Warrior. Although I feel like the voting was a bit closer than it was this time around. It is interesting because it could be argued that both Dark Knight and Gunbreaker have been made easier. I don't feel Warrior has changed much, and Paladin has been made like marginally harder maybe? Yet nothing else changed.